Today we are privileged to study a very familiar text, the Great Commission found in Matthew chapter 28. Just go to Mark and go back a few words, and you've made your way to Matthew 28. It's the very last chapter of the first book, the first gospel there in the New Testament. This is probably one of the most well-known Bible passages in the evangelical world. But I have to add, it may be one of the most well-known, but it's perhaps the least obeyed. It's the most prominent of Jesus' commands to us followers, but it's probably the most neglected. I'm sure there are other commands that we neglect, but I'm not sure there's any other command anywhere in the Bible that we forget, ignore, or just plain disobey than the command of Jesus for us to make disciples. So I thought I'd give us a little bit of a break from 1 John and encourage all of us to take a fresh look at the whole idea of evangelism, of making disciples, of sharing the gospel. And we'll spend a few weeks doing this, talking about sharing our faith. Should be a refreshing and encouraging time for all of us, and I pray it will bless you as it already has blessed me. Let's read our text. Matthew chapter 28. I'm going to start in verse 16. I'll go to the end of the chapter. Into the book, technically. Matthew 28, beginning 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. But some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." I pray the Lord blesses the reading of His Word. Some of you know this because I shared it with you a year or more ago, but my mother's last words to me were this: "Get your girls to Disneyland." Believe it or not, that's what she said. Now, this is not as shallow as you might think. She could really care less about Disneyland and Disney characters and all the things that are at Disney. There's a little bit of a backstory to this. My dad called me a couple of months before my mom passed away and said, the doctors are giving your mom about a year, 8 months, maybe 10 months at best probably for her. And she is going to be sleeping more and more. She's already sleeping about 18 to 20 hours a day, and she doesn't want to, she wants to be able to see you, talk to you, be with you before she passes away. So she'd like for you guys to come and spend some time with her before she's incapable of communicating. The last few months of her life may be spent just sleeping. So, of course, we obliged her. We got a plane and we flew to California, and being the cheapskate I am, I realized it'd be cheaper to rent a car in California and drive to Oklahoma and then drive back. And I thought, well, you know, it's kind of the middle of the summer. It'd be a good time to take a vacation. So we went, and mission accomplished. We saw our mom, a very tearful goodbye. Probably the worst day of my life to say goodbye, knowing that I wouldn't probably see her alive again. Said goodbye to my mother. Got in a car and we made a little vacation. Our plan was we're going to stop at Grand Canyon and then go to Disneyland and then fly back home. And again, the idea was that Mom probably wouldn't die for a number of months, and this would be a good opportunity for us to take a little family vacation. So we went to Oklahoma. We spent about 10 days there in Oklahoma, spending time with my mom, and said goodbye to her, a very tearful goodbye. Got in our car. The very next day, drove all the way to the Grand Canyon, which is quite a long drive. And saw the Grand Canyon. I remember as we pulled up the Grand Canyon and walked out onto that little palisade there at the visitor center, and I got a phone call. My dad called me and said, "Your mom is really, she's slipping. She's not wanting to get out of bed anymore." She was getting out of bed about 3 or 4 hours a day and would talk and commune with us and then go back to sleep. My dad said, "She doesn't really want to get out of bed. She's barely able to talk. And she'd like to say something to you knowing that she may not wake up after this." The doctors are still saying a couple of months before she passes away, but she wants to talk to you. So they put the phone up to her ear. In a very feeble voice, my mom says, "You don't try to come back It's going to be months before I die. You get those girls to Disneyland. Ever selfless, ever self-sacrificing. So what I heard from my mom in her last words were just really a consummation of who she is. Selfless, non-self-aggrandizing, not trying to push herself. She wasn't thinking about some kind of profound thing that we would remember her by. She just was being herself. You don't worry about me. You don't think about me. You bless your children. Well, I went to Disneyland 3 days later. Literally the night we were walking back to our room, our last night before we were going to fly back here to Hawaii, I got the call and she'd passed away. My mom was desperate that we serve others just like her. She served others. Well, most of us will not get the opportunity, like my mom did, to have some last words. And if we do have that time, I doubt we'll sit around and mull on it and think about it and try to come up with something profound. We'd probably do something very similar to my mom. We just speak out of the heart. We just say what's on our heart and who we are. And of course, my mom, like I said, her life was a life of sacrifice, of self-denial. And those words were probably the best words that she could have said to me, indicating her own character. Well, we are so blessed because the apostles who were in charge of writing the New Testament included many of Jesus' last words. And many of his words, not just leading up to his death, but after his resurrection, between the resurrection and his ascension, which was a 40-day period of time. They recorded a number of things that Jesus said. And of course, Jesus had last words before he died. And of course, some of the last words are the words that we just read. In those 40 days or so, he taught his disciples a number of things. Most of what he taught them were out of the Old Testament. And we have several accounts as Jesus taught his disciples before he was ascended. He taught his disciples about their mission on earth. And at least 2 times, probably more than that, at least 2 times, he pointed them to our objective as Christians to make disciples. We see it here. We see it, in fact, right before he ascends to heaven in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, right? And the idea is the same. Make disciples of everyone. Go to all ethnicities. Make disciples. Go to all nations. Go to all people. Make disciples. And if you think about this, this is the culmination, the consummation, really, of who Jesus was. It's the consummation of his activity on earth. Remember what Jesus said in Mark chapter 10, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So Christ came to serve. Christ came for the objective of the gospel, fulfilling the gospel and announcing the gospel. For the glory of God, Christ in his first advent did not come to judge, but to provide salvation and to announce that salvation. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, he tells Nicodemus, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already. John 3, 17 and 18. So it should come as no surprise to us that when Jesus was teaching his disciples, not just in that 40-day period, not just leading up to his death, but even in his ministry, we hear Jesus telling them, you're going to do the same thing as me. As the Father has sent me, so what? So send I you. I want you to do the same thing that I have done. As the body of Christ, our job as church people, our job as believers are to live out these last words of Christ, which are really the consummation of who Jesus is. Of all the commands that Christ gives, we should know this command. It is the essence of our mission. It is the essence of who we are as Christians. The apex of his purpose and his person. So for us to honor him, for us to remember him, for us to obey him, is for us to go and do likewise. We give our lives to others. We sacrifice our pride. We live to serve others. Why? For the sake of the gospel, just like Christ. Parents, I've got news for you. Your job, your calling, your objective in life is not to make sure your child gets the best scholarship, or is the best at sports, or is the best academically, or plays the guitar better than anyone else. Your objective is to make your children disciples of Jesus Christ. That's your objective. And you've missed the point if you're aiming at other things. You'd better know how to do that. You better know how to make a disciple. Everyone else, your neighbors, your coworkers, your employers, your employees, guess what? The same is true of you. Your objective. God put you in a whole web of relationships so that there would be a redeeming value. So these people could hear the gospel. So these people would have a light. So these folks could know Christ through you. The consummate purpose of Christ was to come and give his life to others, to give the gospel, the good news to them, and he has left you here and me here to do the exact same thing. I had a professor in seminary. I think I've told you this story before, maybe in a Sunday school class, perhaps on a Sunday morning, I can't remember. Professor in seminary by the name of Tim Bucher, and by the way, Dr. Bucher is Jared and Jamie LeBon's pastor now. They're in Louisville, Kentucky. If you guys remember, Jared and Jamie were here for a number of years. But I think it was Dr. Bucher some 15, 18 years ago. He told us about a time that he was preaching at a church, and he preached about evangelism. And a lady came to the front after his sermon and met him down at the front, and she introduced herself. And Dr. Bucher said, "Now, what do you do for a living, ma'am?" And she said, "I'm an evangelist." And Dr. Bucher thought, "Oh, no, man, she thinks she's, Billy Graham or something weird. What's going on here?" She went on, "I'm an evangelist cleverly disguised by God as a nurse in the local hospital." She got it, right? She realized her mission is the same as all believers' mission, whether pastors or lay people or nurses or doctors or pilots or whatever. Our objective is to call people out of darkness into his marvelous light, to be an ambassador of Christ, pleading with people to be reconciled with God through his Son, Jesus Christ. Now, speaking of seminary professors, they have studied and surveyed. Why do Christians not make disciples? Why are Christians so hesitant, American Christians in particular, so hesitant about making disciples? Now, Christians have a bad track record, especially American Christians. They have a bad track record with their neighbors and their friends and their coworkers, with their extended family, and they have a really bad track record, believe it or not, with their own children. Christians have bad track records with their own children. So there's been many studies. Professors have come up with all kinds of studies and surveys to find out why are Christians so terrible at the most important command that Christ gives us. Why do we drop the ball on this last will and testament of Christ? Why do we fail this? Well, they come up with all kinds of lists and different ways. In fact, one of my professors who has gone on to be the president of Lifeway, I saw an article that he wrote recently about 7 or 8 reasons why people don't evangelize, and there's other books you can read as why do people don't evangelize. But as I look at it, and I actually spent a whole semester, one of my classes, looking at evangelism and the idea of personal evangelism in the church, and a big chunk of that class was taken up of why your church people won't want to evangelize. So we studied it, we looked at all the research, and there's all kinds of lists and reasons, but as I see it, there are 3 basic reasons, and I think any reason could be lumped into this category, in one of these 3 categories. The first category, we're not going to study too much, but I'm going to allude to it over the next few weeks. The first reason is this: you're not saved. There are a lot of people who call themselves Christians, who go to church, who have adopted the accoutrements of church, who look very Christian-y, who believe some things about God, who like Bible study, who like maybe getting their minds involved, but they're just not true Christians. It'd be like me trying to convince you to go on vacation in Australia. I mean, I've got the Wikipedia entry. I've got some pictures. My daughters, who don't know what an Australian accent sounds like, say that I have a good Aussie accent. But that's the limit. I've never even changed planes in Australia. I know nothing about it. I'm sure it's a beautiful place. I've watched things that happen in Australia. It's a wonderful place. I assume I'd love to go there one day. But I have absolutely zero experience with Australia. Some people love the idea of Christianity. They sit in the church every week. They're related to Christian people. They think of themselves as a Christian. They really like the idea of heaven. But we can't expect them to be very passionate about telling anybody about it because they have really no experience having a true, genuine relationship with God. And I think that's really, to be blunt, I think that's the main reason why most American Christians don't share, because most American Christians aren't true believers. They really don't know what it is to know Christ. Well, like I said, that reason I'm going to allude to, and throughout this series, maybe you can sort of check yourself and make sure maybe the reason you can't or won't share the gospel with others is perhaps because you're not a genuine believer. And I'll allude to that from time to time. Really, what I want to focus on in this sermon series are these next two reasons why people don't evangelize. So a second reason why many people don't share the gospel is you just don't have the passion. You are a true Christian. You are a true believer. There's a desire somewhere down deep in your heart. You feel obligated. You know that you really have this nagging sense that you ought to share the gospel with other people, but you just don't think about it that much. It's not a passion of yours. It's not something that you think of when you first meet people. You're thinking of other things. Your objective in relationships with other people is other things. Even if you do think of it, there's not enough passion to bring it out. It just sort of lurks there in the back of your mind. Perhaps you're afraid of what they'll think about you. Perhaps you're afraid you're going to feel like you're imposing something on them or offensive to them. Perhaps you're afraid of them, that maybe they'll think of you in a negative light. And so you just don't have a desire, you don't have a passion. Maybe it's just your personality. You say, well, I'm just kind of a shy person. I don't talk about a lot, and what I do talk about is not going to be the most deep, intimate, personal thing, and that is knowing Christ. Well, this reason all boils down to this emotional position. There's just not a lot of passion. There's not a lot of want. There's not a lot of desire. There's not something that can overcome your shyness or your inhibitions. That passion is simply not there. Third, many don't share the gospel because you're not confident in your knowledge. Maybe you just say, I'm not really sure how I'd share the gospel. I don't know what verses that I would go to. I mean, John 3:16, or what do I do? What verses should I go to? Where would I go? The only thing I really know is my testimony and maybe a couple of verses here and there. I really don't know how to share the gospel. Maybe you would know the basics, but perhaps you're afraid. I don't have the Bible knowledge. They're going to ask a question I don't know the answer to. They're going to have an objection that's going to stump me and put me on my heels and make me embarrassed in front of them. I think this goes along the line with the false notion, and if you did your Lord's Day prep, you came across this, the false notion that only the Christians who are gifted are the ones that are tasked with sharing the gospel. And you learned in the article that the gift of evangelism is really the gift of the evangelist, and it's talking about certain men that God appoints really to do mission work. It's not talking about a specific gift of evangelism. We're all called to evangelize. But maybe you look at it some way like, well, they're gifted in music, or he's gifted in teaching, or they're gifted in that. I'm just not gifted in that, so I don't have to do it. And that's not the truth at all. We're all commissioned to share the gospel, and perhaps maybe that last reason, the reason for knowledge, you feel a little bit insecure about sharing the gospel. Well, thankfully, the Bible addresses all of these things. The Bible addresses all of these reasons why we might not share the gospel. And I hope to give you some truth from the Bible that will help you foster a passion for evangelism. That's really what we're going to look at first. Sort of the first few sermons are going to look at that first reason why you may not evangelize, and that's that passion. That's the passion, and I really hope that you'll study these words with me in the next few weeks, and you'll gain the heart of the Gospel Herald. That's why I titled this sermon. I'm not very creative, so this sermon is the heart of the Gospel Herald, part 1, and then you got part 2, and then part 3. Don't ask me to come up with all these different sermon titles. But it's all this basic subject as addressing that one issue, that passion. Maybe that's where you would say you are. I just don't have a passion. I just don't think about it all that much. My life is so busy and crazy and all these other things are going on. I just don't think about it all that much. I don't have that great passion. I don't wake up in the morning thinking about who I might talk to or who I might tell the gospel to. I don't have that passion. So I hope over the next few weeks to study this subject, and I hope to light a fire, give you a passion to tell others to make disciples. Then after a few weeks in that, we're going to look at this subject, the telling of the gospel truth. Type A people, you like that alliteration? The telling of the gospel truth? Just like the heart of the gospel herald. What components of the gospel do you need to convey to honestly present the gospel? What are the non-negotiables? What are the elements that you've got to present to give a faithful presentation of the gospel? What are the things that someone must believe and understand in order to be saved? And so we're going to spend 3, 4, 5, 6, 20 weeks there studying those components. No, it'll just be 4 or 5 weeks probably. Look at those texts. My hope is that maybe you'll have some texts memorized, 4 or 5 verses, and you understand them, and you can just explain those verses to people. All right? Now, my greatest hope, my greatest desire, my prayer is that we would find the joy of obeying Christ in this. It is a wonderful blessing to obey Christ. And I'll tell you this, especially obeying Christ together. It's fun to think and strategize. It's a joy to sit in your family group and talk about the people whom you're trying to share Christ with and to pray for them together. To strategize, to answer questions of one another. Well, what did you say? Well, I said this. Well, would you go to that website? Here's a great website. Here's a great resource. This is a joy that we will find in obeying Christ. And let me say, there might be an added blessing, and here it is. God may just bless our efforts. He didn't promise that every time we share the gospel, someone's going to get saved. In fact, we know that a lot of times they'll reject it. But we do know that the way God saves His children is through personal evangelism. And so quite possibly, if we as a church, as an army, go out into this world and begin to target possible disciples and begin to share the gospel with them and to begin to meet with them and read the word with them, it is quite possible that God would bring a number of people into the kingdom through your ministry. And what a joy it would be to see that, to see new faces, to see people whom you've been praying for in this congregation worshiping for the very first time in their lives, truly worshiping God. So good stuff. It's going to be challenging. It's going to push you to do things and say things and be something a little different perhaps than you feel like you are. It's going to push you a little bit. But I think also it'll probably relieve you. Maybe you've had a little misunderstanding of what evangelism really is. Maybe you've got some type of weird proselytizing in your mind that you think maybe you're supposed to do. And maybe this will serve as not only inspiration, but perhaps even a little bit of a relief for you. And I hope a level of inspiration. All right, let's get into this. To gain the heart of Jesus Christ, we have to go to His words. We have to study what Jesus says when it comes to sharing the good news. What did He want of us? And the ultimate passage that you go to, really the starting point and the finishing point, is you go to the Great Commission that we read here in Matthew chapter 28, 16 to 20. This is really the place we start, it's the place we finish, and it's really what we can find here is the heart of the gospel herald. We can find the attitude, the passion. There are other things that we could discuss and find. There are great truths we can mine from this passage, but I want to sort of look at it from this angle, the passion of someone who shares the gospel with others. Where's the heart? If you struggle with that, my prayer is that this would bless you. All right? What is characteristic of the heart of the gospel herald? Number one, maybe you want to write this down, worshipful. The heart of the gospel herald is worshipful. Look at verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had directed them. Stop right there. Let me take a few moments to just set the scene. Really, most of our morning, the rest of this morning, since we do have some folks joining at the end, we're just going to have time to kind of set the scene here and see really this first idea. A number of days, more likely weeks before this happened there in verse 16, Jesus had died and was resurrected. He made several appearances to his disciples. The apostles mainly, the 12 minus 1. Judas, of course, had hung himself, so we're down to 11. And his purpose was first to prove to them his resurrection was real, that he really had been resurrected. And it was also, as I mentioned earlier, it was also to teach them. You remember the story of the road to Emmaus. He taught them all the things in the Old Testament concerning himself, regarding himself. And so that era, that 40-day period, Jesus was showing them the full meaning of the Bible. Of course, the New Testament would not be written for a few years. The full meaning of the Bible as it existed that day, the Old Testament, he was showing all the fulfillment in him, what all of this meant. So he spent that time teaching them, ministering to them, proving to them his resurrection. And it seems as you read these different appearances, I don't want to get too weird or metaphysical here, the metaphysics of his glorified body are kind of a question mark there, but it seems he just sort of appears and disappears. We don't know if that's exactly what happened. He could just be walking up and walking away. But it seems that he just sort of shows up, teaches, and leaves, and then shows up again, teaches, and is gone again. And John talks about him appearing on several occasions. He teaches, and then he's gone. So don't really know the essence of how he would show up or when he would show up and how he would depart. All we really know is that he would show up, teach them, and depart. Well, at some point in one of those appearances, one of those sessions, he shows up and he does something a little bit different. He tells them to meet him. He sets up a meeting. He says, I want you guys to meet me on a certain mountain in Galilee. And it must have been a certain day, perhaps even a certain time of the day. I want you to meet me on that mountain. Some like to guess which mountain it was, perhaps the Mount of Transfiguration. I think that would be a pretty good guess. Perhaps some other mountain that they're in Galilee around the lake there that they would meet at and he would teach. We don't know which mountain. I suppose it's not too important, or Matthew would have mentioned which mountain it was. Now it's possible, so he told the apostles, meet me on this day, meet me in this place, and we'll convene there. And it's possible, maybe even likely, that word got out that Jesus was going to be there. Perhaps the 11 went home, a couple of them had wives, told their mother-in-laws, told their father-in-laws, and the word got out, and people started hearing about this, all the various levels of ideas of who Jesus was, and people sort of curious to see this Christ. It was very likely that, and very possible that many people, more than just the 11, showed up, though the 11 were the ones whom Jesus told to meet him there. It's very likely that many more people showed up. In fact, as I studied the commentaries, no less than 5 of the commentaries which I read this week, the authors insisted that this is the event that 1 Corinthians 15 alludes to, that 500 people saw him, his resurrected body, at one time. I'm not 100% sure that this is the exact thing that happened. But because we remember the way his public ministry happened, we know that that's very likely, very possible. As Jesus would move, sometimes Jesus would say, hey, I want to get together with you guys. Let's sail across the lake. And as they would sail, people would run along the shore and meet them over there. And you can just see the same kind of excitement. Of course, not as big this time because Jesus is not healing people and he's not feeding a bunch of people. He's just teaching them. And so the people that were showing up, they weren't showing up near the amount of numbers, and perhaps they were afraid of reprisals and the authorities being on them if they follow Jesus Christ or act like they're followers of Jesus Christ. So there weren't 5,000, but there were 500 people, very likely, that they gathered there with the 11 who were the ones who were told to meet Jesus there at that certain place and certain time. Now, I would imagine that a few days had passed since the apostles had seen Jesus, So the apostles were very eager to see Jesus again, to learn of these great truths. I mean, who wouldn't? If you're an apostle and you had finally come to understand that Jesus really was whom he said he was, he really is the Christ of God, and you've heard his teaching. I mean, if you were an apostle, you would want to hear his teaching again. And if you were one of the crowd, perhaps on varying levels of belief, maybe you believed like the apostles, you believed their testimony, you just wanted to see him with your own eyes. Or maybe you just heard about it and you didn't know. You wondered, is this all true? All these people gather with great anticipation because Jesus told them where he was going to show up this time. And you can just feel the anticipation. Like I said, the other post-resurrection appearances were just that. They were just appearances. He just shows up. This one was a meeting which he called. And you know, people had to wonder. They're in expectation, they're in eager anticipation. They would have wondered, is this the time he's going to miraculously defeat the Romans? Is this when he's going to oust the Herodians and set up the nation of Israel? Is this when he's going to set up his kingdom? Is that why he's called this meeting? Is this the time? For others, it would have been more fundamental. Like I said, other people would have said, is this really Jesus? Is this some kind of trick? Is this some kind of hidden twin brother that they've tricked us with? So all these people are showing up, and they're showing up with great anticipation. What is Jesus going to say? What is Jesus going to do? And so if you have this crowd of people and the 11, and they're all just sort of standing around, waiting, mumbling, wondering, perhaps a lot of them doubting, but all of them standing there with eager anticipation, waiting quietly, hushed whispers, and then Jesus shows up. Jesus shows up. I imagine a shout. There he is! Jesus is here! And immediately, what do people do? As soon as they realize Jesus is there, what do people do? Verse 17 again. And when they saw him, they worshiped him. He's not even addressed the crowd. He's just arrived. Maybe he's walking up from a distance. Maybe just appeared, but as soon as they see him, many of them fall to their face. And that's really the word for worship there. They fall to their face. There are other words for worship. This indicates that quite possibly they fell to their face and worshiped him. But it says there, some doubted. Some doubted. I think that little phrase there, some doubted, is a great argument, just sort of as an aside. It's a great argument for the veracity, the truth of Scripture. You see, the Bible is not interested in tricking people and whitewashing history, hoaxing people, coercing them to something made up or twisted or something full of half-truths and candy-coated stories, all concocted to deceive people. No, the Bible is interested in the truth. You read the Bible, what you find out is even the greatest heroes, even the men and women after God's own heart, have all their foibles right there for us to see. The Bible is not interested in myth, it's interested in truth. If it was like many other religious texts, it would do everything it could to hide people's doubt, to obscure the fact that people doubt, that people fail, that people aren't blind in their faith, but need evidence like Thomas. It would do everything it could to deceive us into believing that everyone just sort of blindly, blithely, glibly followed. There would be no negatives, there would be no doubts, and it would canonize all these people for unquestioned blind faith. So why is that phrase here? And some doubted. Here's the answer. Because that's what happened. It's true. There were people, and I believe it probably was not among the original 11, because I think the proof had been given them. I believe it was from the other crowd. People were there, and people doubted, and they wondered, is this really Christ? They hadn't seen him. They perhaps, because this is up in Galilee, they perhaps were not down in Jerusalem when this all took place, and the death and the resurrection and all those things happened. They didn't see any of the miracles. They didn't see any or hear any of the firsthand testimony. They just heard sort of a rumor. They hadn't seen him. And they just couldn't believe. They doubted, just like Thomas. They doubted. And just like Thomas, they wanted to see him in the flesh. People wanted to know. People wanted to be convinced. Did Jesus really rise from the grave? Is this some big trick, or is this Jesus truly the Christ of God? So they're there not just to hear the teaching of Christ, but to see if this is true or not. Jesus came up, it says he came up, or he approached them, and some see that as Jesus giving them the evidence, like with Thomas, giving them the evidence they needed. He didn't stand afar. He didn't stand up on a hill and call out to them. He walked up so they could see him in the flesh. Jesus walks up to them. He gives them the evidence they're asking for. He is not only Jesus of Nazareth, he is the resurrected Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God. He is the promised one, the anointed one. Most importantly, by giving them this evidence, all that he said about who he is, about the sacrifice, the Lamb of God, all he said about salvation and crucifixion and the resurrection, about becoming his disciple, about his claims of deity, all that he said, including his perfect work, his actions, culminating on the cross, were proven true by none other than God himself. And these people saw for the first time the resurrected Messiah. So for many people there, I believe, this was Resurrection Sunday for them. They saw for the first time Jesus Christ. He is who he says he is. This is their first time seeing and experiencing Jesus firsthand, the resurrected Savior. I gather from this passage that many on that day, in seeing him, believed and were saved. That many people who wondered, who doubted, who were confused, saw him and believed. Well, what's the first thing that he says to them? Verse 18. And Jesus came, and that's that word approached or came up to, and Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. This is absolutely staggering. If you remember, look back at the birth of Christ. You have this incongruous picture of this little baby, but you have the angels praising and the magi praising and the shepherds praising and all these people worshiping, even Mary and Joseph to an extent worshiping their own son. All these people worshiping, but it's an incomplete picture. But now you have the picture, and it's making sense. The picture going back all the way not just to the birth of Christ and the people worshiping there, but going back into the Old Testament, the wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Here he is, the God-man in the flesh, standing before you. All of it was veiled, all of it was incomplete until he was resurrected. Finally, people are getting it. It's making sense to them. And they fall on their faces, and they worship. And Jesus makes this staggering statement, I have all authority everywhere. There's no place in heaven or on earth in which I do not have full authority. And by the way, what a great idea, what Christ thinks about his position in heaven. At the right hand of God is not a place that is any less authoritative than God's position. Exactly as God, he has all authority, not only on earth, but on heaven. Now let's wrap this up. Let's just place ourselves there in the context of that day. This will tell us what it seeks to convey, I believe, about our the very first attitude that we should have if we're going to have a passion to evangelize, really the first principal attitude of anybody who wants to obey Christ in any way, really, but in particular, how to maintain a heart of making disciples. Just walk through this. You're a Christian. There was a time in which you were not a Christian, right? There was an era of your life, whether it be a very short time at the very beginning of your life, or whether it be a long period of time, and you lived many years not knowing Christ. Perhaps you weren't saved until you were an adult. So it was a long time that you were not a Christian. And in that time, you did not believe. Oh, you may have had some kind of assent or mental acquiescence to the things of God and desire for the things of God. Maybe you had some sort of spiritual ideas and some thoughts, and you felt positively about God, but these were just surface. It was not of the Spirit, so it was simply, really, ultimately self-righteousness, tainted with sin, no matter how sincere you were or thought of yourself. But God had set His love on you before the foundation of time. And He carefully orchestrated a series of circumstances to put you in certain places, in a certain time, with a certain family, good or bad. All of it according to His masterful plan, and He reached down and He began to change your heart. He opened up your eyes. He changed you. He softened your hard heart to the gospel. And He began drawing you to the truth. For many of you, maybe you didn't even perceive that this was happening, but He was calling you to Himself. You could say it this way: He summoned you to the mountain. He wanted you to come and see Him for the first time. And one day, perhaps in this stream of events as God orchestrated everything, perhaps you saw Jesus sort of as a blur, sort of as someone from a distance, and you began to gaze upon Him. And it's just as though you joined that crowd on the hillside that day, and Jesus came to you. He approached you. And though you were asking questions, is this all true? Did Jesus really rise from the grave? Is this some big trick, or is Jesus really the Christ of God? And then suddenly, in complete clarity, you saw Jesus Christ. And you fell to your face, and you worshiped Him. And for the first time, you could truly worship Christ. Now, that joy, that submission, that worship that you know as a believer compels you, propels you to share that with others, right? To know that God uses broken vessels, the broken vessels that brought you to Christ. God uses broken vessels like the apostles. God uses broken vessels like pastors and friends and neighbors. God uses broken vessels like you to bring people, to summon people to the mount so they can finally fall on their face and worship God. Great motivation, right? Great motivation to tell people of Christ. Great heart for us to have, to be worshipful.